In this video, we'll cover how to prepare your raw files before you send them over to Photoshop for blending. We won't cover every exhaustive detail of how to process raw files because we'll get into more depth as we build through successive edits later in this course, and we'll go much deeper on color in the section titled Getting Great Color. This video is going to be much more about the sort of things you can do at this phase that have positive or negative implications for your blending later and are just important things to think about, as well as the overall approach. So first, notice that we've got image 7110 here, which is my base exposure. I have 7111, which is a -2 exposure. If we take a look at the shutter speed here, it's 1/40th versus 1/10. And then we have our +2 exposure here at 0.4 seconds with image 7112. So this is all I'm going to need to blend. Let's take a look at which exposures we need, because the first pass is always selecting your exposures and then determining which ones to use. So when I look at my base exposure, it's an excellent exposure. I could have probably exposed it a little bit more to the right even. I was working quickly, so I didn't nail it perfectly. But this is definitely a highly usable raw file, and I could do the entire edit with a multi-processing approach that we'll cover later on this single raw file. We won't do that here, but it's important to note that there's no clipping in the shadows, there's no clipping in the highlights. If you grab the exposure slider to evaluate it, notice we can bring the exposure up, and it's not really clipping even at +1 stop. So it's actually underexposed by a good bit. Once we get up to 2 stops, it's overexposed. So I really should have had an exposure somewhere between this first one and this last one. The +1 exposure would have been the ideal one to capture, but it's okay. We're going to have plenty of detail in this image. Conversely, bringing the exposure slider down to values below 0, notice that it's bringing back a lot of detail and color. So everything we need is in this raw file. There's no benefit to going any darker because this file has everything, and you always want to use the brightest exposure you can that retains the highlight detail. So this one is a better exposure to use than this next exposure. To compare them, let's make them equal. We'll set this one to -2 on the exposure and then advance to the next image, and notice that between these two exposures we have effectively the same results with a little bit of difference in the ambient lighting hitting the shadows, which we wouldn't use from this frame anyway. So the only real difference between these is the clouds are moving and some subtle differences in the color, but ultimately I don't see any reason that we should use this darker exposure. If I like this slightly orange cast here, I can grab it from this frame just by making some different color adjustments. So this is a much better frame than the -2 exposure. There's nothing to be brought in there. I'm going to keep this frame. I'll hit 1 star, hitting the 1 button to mark that. On this next frame, we aren't going to need that, so I'm going to reject that by hitting the X key. You could use whatever system you like, but I do recommend somehow marking your images to know which ones you're going to use for blending, which ones you're not going to use. You'll see me in some of these demos. For example, on this image here, I hit the 6 key to make it red and highlight the frames that I've used. It seems like overkill when you're just looking at 3 images here, but most of my edits will include maybe 100 different shots from the same scene. So marking them is critical, even if I can remember what I'm doing today. If I come back in a week or 2 or 6 months later, I want to have good notes as to which frames I used, because I might need to re-edit the raw files and I need to know which one's which. Additionally, if I start multi-processing the raw files, I'm going to start using virtual copies of these. So you want to have a pretty clear record of the layers that you edit. Let's take a look at our brightest exposure here, this +2 exposure. It obviously has clipped highlights. If we bring down the exposure, they never recover. So this image is severely damaged in the sky and unusable for the sky. However, look at all that great detail in the shadows. Since we underexposed our original, by the time we bring up the exposure in that one by a couple of stops, we're adding a little bit of noise. Might be acceptable here on sand and this surface, but I would like to have as noise-free of an image as possible, so we'll use this image solely for the purpose of reducing noise. It's not going to bring back any clipped shadow detail because everything was in range, but it is going to give us better shadow definition and reduce noise in those shadow areas. So we'll also use this one. So let's mark it with 1 star. I'll also mark it red by hitting the 6 key. And let's go ahead and hide our rejects. We don't have to look at that underlying image. So now that we know which frames we're going to work with, we need to do the raw edits. I'm going to start with my base image here, and let's reset the exposure. What I'm looking for in this image is going to be getting the color and tonality to be where it should be. I don't have to get these perfect, especially the color, but it is helpful. If I make changes in the raw that affect the layer mask that I would create, the luminosity mask that I would create in Photoshop, then it is important. So affecting the white balance here is not necessarily going to change that mask, but it's always best to get your white balance correct in raw because it produces better quality. So I could adjust this later on a Camera Raw Smart Object or by re-exporting the raw file, but I would prefer to get it correct here. And in this image, I think it could be warmed up a little bit. These clouds are fairly blue, so a little bit more warmth, bringing things up to maybe right around 7,000 there. And then the tint on this, I generally like to push things more towards magenta as much as I can without causing an obvious magenta cast or losing color separation between areas that are sort of red and magenta and other colors. So let's bring that up a little bit. And even that's too much. I'm going to just leave it around 0. So a very small adjustment there. Then we have the exposure, contrast, highlights, other tone controls here in the middle. All of these controls can affect your luminosity mask, and generally speaking are best to get corrected this phase. I'm not saying you can't change them later and still get an acceptable result with the mask you create, but it is creating a risk of problems if you don't have it correct at this phase. So I generally would like to adjust these things. In an image like this, I've got this nice dark moody sky that I'm going to have to transition this middle zone. The key to a successful blend is that the transition areas match as much as possible. In this case, bringing up the shadows may give me a better transition through the middle part of this image. Look how nice that middle part of the image looks. I don't have a very exciting foreground, but the midground looks pretty nice. And if I double click that just to look before versus here, I am affecting the clouds on the horizon. So I have to ask myself whether or not I want to introduce the shadows here and potentially affect those clouds. In this case, it's probably okay, but there's an alternative way we can apply the shadows here, and that is to use a graduated filter. So if I click on that or hit the M key, we can drag up. If you hold the Shift key, you'll get a nice straight line and create a transition. And then I'm going to zero everything else out, but bring up the shadows here. And now we can bring this up a little bit, probably angle it a little bit to be more equivalent to that horizon line. And let's bring up the shadows just a little bit more. And we'll bring this up a little bit further. So I'm just trying to ease that transition here. If I delete this for a moment, notice how that foreground got much nicer when I add it here. So I'm going to leave that in just for the sake of providing a little bit easier transition without lightening up this cloud too much, bearing in mind that the top edge of this mountain is not being lightened as much, but it's going to be okay the way we're going to blend this. So let's go ahead and close that, and we'll continue on. I don't think I need to bring in any more highlight detail, but I do like to check that for the skies. And maybe just a little bit is nice in the sky here, so I'll just bring in about 16 points here. The whites rarely are they something that I want to adjust unless I'm going to deliberately try and bring them up to do something like bring out detail here. Generally leave these alone. Blacks, only if things are clipping. So tone controls there, I'm just trying to get them close. They don't have to be perfect, we can fix them later. Next up is the clarity slider. This is one to really watch. I would strongly suggest you use 0 clarity on your raw. Let's zoom in and take a look why. When we look at this edge here, this image is largely going to be about blending this sky to this foreground. Now we may well have a lot of transition across them, but in some blends you're going to have a hard edge, and anything you do that affects the edge is going to dramatically increase the risk that you get halos in the blend. Watch what happens when we increase the clarity here. See that very subtle white halo here? You might say that's acceptable and live with that here, and certainly as you dial it down to lower values of clarity, you might get to a point where you say you can't see it, although I can still see some minor haloing here. I don't mind it, but here's the thing. If you have a little bit of a halo here, once you create your luminosity mask, it will greatly exaggerate that halo because this brighter edge will get picked up in the luminosity mask and change the blend. So if you have any amount of clarity here, there's a very good chance that if you have a hard edge blend, you're going to have a white halo. And if you see white halos in your image, you want to look at things like clarity and sharpening as probably culprits and the raw processing. So let's undo that. Let's leave this at 0. I think that's a much better approach. Dehaze, perfectly safe to use. It's like other relative tone and color controls. You have some ability to push them around and it's going to be okay. Same with vibrance and saturation. We'll get into the color much later. Okay to move these things around. Generally speaking, get them close, but it's not critical if you have to change them later. Things like the clarity and sharpening, though, that affect the actual pixel location or dramatically change pixel values, those are important things to get right in the raw phase. Tone curve, HSL, split toning, all same sort of thing. If you can get them close in the raw phase, better. Certainly they can be better things done in the raw phase in terms of the quality of the result you get, but don't necessarily have huge impact on the mask depending on how much you push them. With the tone curve, you of course could really make a big difference, but generally speaking, you can get away with some adjustments to these after the fact, even after you've created your layer mask. Sharpening. This is just like the discussion we had on clarity. Even at the default 25 amount of sharpening, there is a very small halo here, relatively imperceptible, but let's push our amount to the full 150%. Now you can see that halo edge. Well, if you can see it at 150, it still exists at 25. It's just much more subtle. And even though you may not see it at around 25, it's going to affect your luminosity masks, and there's a very good chance that you'll create a halo in your blended image. So I would strongly suggest taking sharpening also down to 0. And that may feel disappointing because your image looks very soft. Notice, the sort of tree details and things like that. When I bring up just a little bit, things look a lot more interesting. So you probably intuitively want to leave some sharpening, but I would set it to 0 here. We'll add the sharpening after we do the blend and we have a good luminosity mask, but at this point, it's better to leave it off. Noise reduction, you can safely do this here. It does affect details of the mask, so I would get it right in the raw. We don't need it on this image, so I'm just going to leave it alone. Lens corrections, absolutely something you should do at the raw phase. Not only are these tools generally better, but they will also affect the mask. Chromatic aberration is going to affect your blended image. Now, your blended edge. It does not have a strong effect on this particular image, but if we had a higher contrast edge, you could very well have visible chromatic aberration. And if that chromatic aberration is used to create your layer mask, then there's a very good chance you're going to have haloing. So I would always leave this on. I have never seen a situation where it caused problems in the image. It's always either had no effect or made the image better. So I just like to leave it on for every single image. Profile corrections. This is, of course, something you want to do in the raw phase if you're going to do it, because watch what happens. We're moving on these pixels. Well, if we change that later, our layer mask would not align with the image. So you want to make your changes to any warping of the pixels, like profile corrections. Do it here in the raw phase, and you'll have to make sure it's synced across all your images so that they align. I'll show you that in a second. The transform tool, if you're going to do, for example, vertical keystoning corrections and that sort of thing, this is something you should also do here in the raw phase and make sure it's synced across them. I shouldn't say you should do it in the raw phase. It's certainly optional to do in the raw phase, but if you're going to do it, just make sure that it's synced across your different exposures because you need them to align. I would avoid things like the auto tool that may potentially apply different manipulations to different images. Syncing the auto button does not necessarily mean that each frame gets the exact same adjustment, and if you have things like moving water, it might throw off how it's applied. So use the manual controls in order to make sure that you sync up perfectly frame to frame. Lastly is the camera calibration, which, just like any other color tool, is something you can do at the raw phase, but you don't have to. In this case, I'm going to kick up a little bit of red to bring out more of that fire in the sunset, a little bit of the blue, not too much there. And I think overall, I like where this is sitting right now. So we're going to use these settings, and I'm going to copy it to my other exposures. Now we have a 0 exposure and we have a +2 exposure. But what we want is to blend the exposures one stop apart. This is an image that does not demand having one stop gaps between your layers when you blend them in Photoshop, But oftentimes, if you use 2 stops or more like we're using here, you'll have blend issues. So best practice is to always create 1-stop intervals. You don't have to capture them in the field, you just have to create them. So we can either take our 0 exposure and create a +1, or we can take our +2 exposure and subtract 1 from it in a virtual copy. Taking a look at these, in this exposure, I have some blown highlights right down here near the horizon when I hover over that. So if I bring this exposure down by 1, I might potentially have blown pixels in a transition area. So I wouldn't use this exposure. I would instead use this darker exposure. Right click, choose Create Virtual Copy. And now what I want to do is take the exposure on this and bring it up from 0 to 1. If you had adjusted the exposure to something other than 0, make sure you offset it by 1 from that. So if I'd already gone to say plus 0.6, then I'd want to be at 1.6 here. So the point is that this exposure and this exposure are 1 stop apart relative to each other, considering both the actual shutter speed and other exposure settings and the exposure slider here in Lightroom, so that they have a net 1-stop difference. So now that we have this, we've got the basic settings we need. Let's take a look at our last image here. Notice that we've not applied the other various settings to this image. This one is matched because we created a virtual copy from the end point of this image. However, this image is not synced, and critically, the adjustment to the camera perspective, the lens distortion corrections have not been applied. So if we try and blend these, they won't match. So you want to sync things up. So let's just take a quick look here. This image brought in the adjustment we made to the shadow values. I don't think we need it here in this middle image. Let's go ahead and click on this and just get rid of it. This is the sort of subtle little detail that you'll learn as you do more blending, but there are sometimes little refinements that I make to one image in order to try and make the transition zone from one image to another match a little bit better. And if you do that, chances are that's not an adjustment you'll make to all of your images, but with the exception of those little one-off tweaks, you want your other settings to be synchronized. So let's click on this first image, and we have 2 ways we can do this. We could hit Command C to bring up this dialog and copy the settings, then go to the other images and hit Command V to paste. Or what I find to be easier is just simply Command or Shift click across the whole set. Make sure that the source is the one that's most selected. See how this is a little bit whiter? If we click on these other images, they get a little bit whiter. So make sure that the source one is most selected. Then you can hit Sync and choose what you want to copy. In this case, let's start by saying check all, and then let's unselect the things we don't want to affect. We don't want to affect exposure because our virtual copy was artificially set to a different value. And we don't want to copy over our local adjustments because we don't want that graduated filter on the other exposures. At this point, we do want the other settings. The little thing we did to the highlights is perfectly fine to bring over. Probably actually doesn't matter. The adjustment to lens correction, that's critical that that's the same. We want to make sure that the sharpening and clarity settings are brought over. So just generally speaking, I would copy everything except for known exceptions, hit synchronize. Now all 3 of these images are ready to go, and as we cycle through them, notice that the pixels have perfect alignment because we've fixed any variation from image to image. We're ready to go and begin blending. To do that, just right click on the image and then choose Edit In, and I would open as layers in Photoshop. If you choose to edit in Photoshop, then you'll send each image over as a separate document into Photoshop, which is fine, and you can use Preblend in Lumenzia and that'll work just fine. But I like open as layers in Photoshop for a few reasons. 1, it's just less work once it's in Photoshop, and 2, if you hit save there, it's automatically going to go straight back into Photoshop, whereas the other approach doesn't necessarily know what your source folder was. So it's just a little bit cleaner this way. So I really like this approach.